So one of the big things is balancing setting up camp and resting, which keeps your morale up, and it gives a chance for your kind of poets to talk and record their history and everything, and keeping on the trail because there's a big army behind you. But I was also really interested in the ships that we see are a little bit different to the very traditional like storybook ones that we grew up on, apart from of course the striped sails. And I was wondering if there was what we find archaeologically about what form their boats for ferrying down. We're going down a stream at the moment, but also ocean-faring vessels, whether there was a difference, how we might have moved them over land and also over water.
Well, there's quite a range of types of Viking ships, from the traditional model of the long ship, which could carry up to sort of 60 warriors, to the ocean-going cargo ships that are probably only had a crew of 10 or so, but which you could obtain cattle and goods and would have been used much more for trade. And we do now have quite a lot of archaeological sources for the ships. And they look fairly reasonable representations that
yes, they do. And there is, as far as we can tell, from the number of ships we've got, it seems like there's a sort of diversification through the Viking Age. So by the time we get to the end of the Viking Age, it's looking more like the medieval world.
They're getting more specialised, aren't they, between the cargo ships and the fighting ships.
And this famous boat, which was the centrepiece for the big Vikings exhibition of the last year, this enormous. How long is it?
Is it 60 metres?
I think I was going to say 60 metres. An enormous, long, sort of royal ship, really.
Yes.
Which is clearly not your standard Viking boat, but in many ways encapsulates your idea of what a Viking boat is. Viking ship is.
Yeah. But then they do go right down to the small little ferry boats that we're seeing there as well. And some of the ship burials from the British Isles really are just in that sort of ship rather than the big dramatic ones.
I think one last thing on this kind of visual that we see is we see a lot of these watchtowers and also pyres which they light when intruders or when the dredge are coming. But there's this narrative between they're always worried that when they light the pyres, it'll basically show where they're fleeing from and to. At the same stage, they need to light them to be able to warn people ahead to get out before the intruders come. And certainly out at Mosgard Museum, there's a whole section dedicated around what the use of these pyres were. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about, do we see those archaeologically? Would they have been used as warning? What sort of temporal period did they come in at, or did they even exist outside of our sort of cultural memory of the period?
I don't know in Scandinavia actually. There's lots of work that's been done on this in England, as a sort of Anglo-Saxon defence system against the Vikings. The idea of there being beacons because they were well aware that the Scandinavian attack was happening regularly. They built up an organised system of defence, and beacons we think played an important part in that. The Scandinavia itself, I'm not sure what evidence there is.
I don't think there is any, and certainly no evidence for stone towers of the type we see there. They're a bit more like the Irish towers, really. We see that in monastic towers.
So that's quite interesting, though, that these sort of Vikings have been recast as the victims in this one, whereas I'm not sure if that's really characteristic, and we're seeing much more of these artifacts that are used in these places that were so-called victimized by these attacks.
Yeah.
I mean, what this does do, I suppose, is it shows the complexities of that society, that we tend to think of the Vikings as an other which comes in and makes itself felt on our society, on the English society.
But that's very much a back projection, isn't it,
Absolutely.
from later history? I mean, it would be much more complex than that, with Vikings and Anglo-Saxons fighting on either side, and some of these so-called Viking armies are probably made up from warriors from all over the place.
Yeah. And that the Scandinavians are fighting amongst themselves very clearly.
So again, we have this little bit of a narrative starting up that a lot of the clansmen are getting sort of a bit angsty about it being a young girl who's leading this caravan. And they're talking a lot about how her father was great, but can we trust her? Is she that great? And a lot of that sort of comes into her dialogue as they move on.
We certainly believe that there was a need for sort of chieftains and leaders to prove themselves, that they were as powerful as their followers made them, basically.
reasonable sized Viking fleet with it.
Yeah,
Get
it is,
rid of
it is.
that. That's I'm happy with that.
So here he's starting to get very dramatic about his misery and being very forthright and dramatic about the whole scene. And interestingly, the more dramatic he gets and the more sort of he plays to the crowd, the more the morale of the ships improve as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that comes out of the, an established idea that the kings of sort of Viking and medieval Scandinavia are having people perform poetry for them in their praise. That's an established fact.
So this is the main map, which the game sort of revolves around, and each of the places has these great backstories to them. Let's get out of this dialogue section before we can have a look around properly. But one of the things that I really liked was that they kind of used these stylized, runic-looking sort of scripts around the place, and in a bunch of other instances, not on the map, they actually put in runic on a lot of these standing stones and a lot of the places that you pass through. But some of the things which they talk about within the sort of like either the cardinal directions or the way which the map is set up tie in a lot into the sort of culture of the time. And I was wondering if we had examples of maps being used, would they have looked like this in this very top-down perspective, or is that a more modern idea of what a map might be?
We have no idea, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's got to be, given that the other than the runic inscriptions, the Viking society wasn't really a literate society. I don't think they would have used maps in the sense that we regard them.
No.
They probably had quite a fine-tuned sense of geography, but held in memory rather.
And we can see that in the sort of the names that are given to sort of landmarks and that sort of thing. You can imagine people navigating by the different sorts of headlands that they could see. But that's a very different thing to having it all written down on a map, isn't it?
Yeah,
What's nice is the art around here that looks like a runestone.
Yes.
The curly script around the outside is quite nice.
Yeah, one of the things that talking about the kind of oral history thing, a lot of the recordings of the places, like the place names and their stories, is all done through quotations or through what people would say, like if they were talking to each other about it, rather than it being a plain description on the map, which I think ties in quite well to what you were saying.
Well, there must have been ways of measuring distance.
Yeah.
Quite how they would have done that over great distances, I don't know.
Probably in terms of days' travel,
Yeah,
normally. We
yeah.
do have an account from
of course.
a Norwegian
Yes.
sailor, Otter, who sailed down from northern Norway and visited England, and it's all recorded in the number of days it took him to get from one town to another.
And there have been attempts to retrace that journey and see, well, if he was going this fast and he went this far, where might have he ended up? And trying to work out where these places were that he called the furthest north anywhere in Norway.
So
This is
every
a camp.
every now and then you have to set up camp to be able to feed everyone and keep them happy. And within the camp, there's a training tent where you can basically train all your crew. You can rest, and then you can sort of see how your party's doing.
Some nice straight lines of tents, though.
Yes, it's very organised.
So another one of the interesting things that we see is that there are a lot of characters who are quite crazy, this guy being one of them. And a lot of the time, the more crazy characters are depicted with having like dark rings or makeup kind of lines around their eyes. And another thing which I found interesting is a lot of the tattoos that we see are in green ink. And I was wondering whether we had evidence of there being a lot of tattoos. Again, the Viking series has started to popularise this idea. And whether those would have been green, blue, black ink or otherwise.
Well, there are descriptions, aren't there, of how, the best descriptions of how sort of Vikings, if you want to call them that, looked, come from the sort of the east. And there are descriptions of people being covered sort of from the neck down with colour. But it doesn't precisely say tattoos.
No.
And it certainly doesn't tell you what the tattoos were of or what colours they were. And the same similar kind of claims have been made for makeup as well. We have a couple of accounts really that we can can extrapolate from. There's no reason to believe this isn't happening, but it's not completely clear.
Any artifacts or anything that would indicate that tattooing?
No, nothing that we could.
We don't have obvious pins with pigment on or anything like that. No.
Okay.
No. The best tangible evidence we've got for appearance is in the idea of the filed teeth
Yeah.
that we're starting to find from some burials where it seemed to be you could make yourself look fiercer by filing a groove on your front
Oh
teeth.
my goodness.
Yeah, there's been a recent suggestion that might be actually be a way of sort of identifying slaves rather than for I think it's whether it's that or whether it's a status or a kind of an aggression thing. We don't know, but it's certainly something very unusual that is very striking when you see it. You don't mistake it.
I like the idea of them resting each winter, or not necessarily each winter, but resting at the camp. We do
Yeah.
have evidence
Yeah,
for
we
that.
And a lot of the camp life as well ties into a lot of the narratives about how when they get quite down about life, they go and they make up camp and they drink until they can't remember anything,
Yeah.
and then they're good to go again. And that's a really important part of the culture in this game, is how you manage their drinking habits.
Right.
And as, again, I guess the Vikings TV series has brought in a lot of this idea as well about the mead halls and about people drinking a lot. And do we have a lot of evidence for that? Would mead have been the primary thing which people were drinking, or were there other beverages which might have been?
Well, we know that both mead and ale are imported, don't we?
Yeah.
There's talk of wine, and certainly there's evidence that that's being imported, and you get you do get Carolingian, so continental European glass vessels, which would probably be used for wine, but mead and beer are going to be more likely, I think.
Yeah, we've got corn drying ovens, which has probably been sort of barley batch being dried for making ale.
And it is a big part of society, that, and not just the process of getting drunk, but the sort of communality, the coming together within the sort of protection of your leader is an important part of binding people together as a community, and it's that's in all the sagas. It's there in the evidence of just the amount of halls that we find.
Yes, yeah, an important part of showing hospitality.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, there's one in the last Banner Saga. There's a period where, as a leader, if you don't drink with your people, they lose respect for you because you're not part of the community, and therefore they don't know if they can trust you. So it's interesting to hear that that's actually a tie-in. On this section where you go into the camp, you can see each of the people that you have and what their abilities are. And one of the key abilities of the humans is the shield wall. Which I think comes up a lot in our kind of popularized memory of how Vikings would go about battle. And do we have any idea how they would have approached battlefields? Were shield walls a thing, or how might we otherwise have arranged battle in that period?
I don't actually know where the idea of the shield wall comes from.
I think it does largely come from the later saga sources. So we don't certainly. Shields were important. They're a common find in warrior graves, but archaeologically we don't and can't have evidence for how battles were fought, really. There's been some ideas that actually the combat was probably highly ritualised and a lot of single combat.
Yeah. There's been a lot of argument about the scale of warfare, hasn't there? How big these armies were and that sort of thing, and whether the kind of the very elaborate helmets that we find, whether they were actually really part of battle gear or whether they were more ritualised. Those kind of things we talked about. But that's kind of the extent that we get into.
Interesting. And in terms of the weaponry, we obviously have here like a two-handed axe, and then we have a spearman.
Yeah.
One of the more sort of like hammer-headed.
Not so sure about that, but the throwing axe like he's got there is they're often found, and the swords, so the other key weapon, often with very richly decorated runic inscriptions. They're very important personal objects.
And all of these things, swords in particular, are an enormous investment in terms of the amount of metal that's gone, the amount of iron that's gone into making these objects, the amount of skill and time that's gone into it. So they're not just weapons for killing people. They're a weapon that you invested a lot in in order to kill people with. So they become symbols of power and status as well.
We find a lot with it's like this guy is from a lower caste, like a lower part of society, and so his clothing and his weaponry is much plainer versus someone like Ludin, who comes from a very noble family, who's very adorned. Would we expect to see that? Would we expect to see people from lower levels not having such adornment or ritualization, I guess, associated with a lot of their weaponry and dress?
I think so.
Yeah. Well, access to wealth is going to be very much controlled by the lords. And part of their role is what they choose to pass down to their followers.
In literate societies around this time, it's the kind of the way in which you dress is is quite codified. We don't have that detail written down for the Scandinavian societies, but we think it's probably going to be something along the same lines. You would have known whether you were dealing with somebody who was of sort of significance or not from how they looked. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
So, as I was saying a little bit earlier, this guy's special ability that he has is basically to tell a tale of strength and heroism on behalf of his clan as they enter the battlefield, and it basically adds a lot of damage to his allies. Like, it puts them into a fury and they're able to attack better, and the people who are on the opposing side get really scared. And I was wondering if we had any evidence either from the sagas or whatnot in terms of whether people were on the battlefield sort of telling stories, or what role people might have had other than warfare within a battle scene.
I can't think of examples of poetry going into battle. It's certainly going the other way around. It's very common. Going into poetry.
I think the last thing on here is this guy is what they call a mender, and his role is as a part healer to the caravan, so he can basically mend wounds a lot more effectively, but he can also manipulate parts of the environment as well, so he has a deal of sort of ritual and magical power associated with him. And I think, like, when you look onto his staff, there's a lot of pictorial kind of representations of the magic in the world and of the story of that.
Well, as we were saying before, this is something where we do think there's probably a female role, particularly in terms of medicine, healing, tied in with witchcraft as well.
The whole sort of shamanic idea and the idea that the world is sort of inhabited by things that we don't understand is quite an important part of the sort of Norse worldview, we think.